In this video, I'll go over the small town of Bremen in the northwestern part of 10 towns. I'll be looking at how we can prepare for and run Bremen, as well as how we can put as much interesting stuff and foreshadowing into the town as possible. First off, I need to make clear that this video is the 11th, I think, video in a series of videos on running Rime of the Frostmaiden. I'm sort of putting out a sample way you can structure chapter 1, so in this structure the characters have gone through Brynchanda and Targos and may head to Bremen or Termine next, but you can use the information in this video even if your characters have arrived in Bremen first or later. That doesn't really matter as much, at least not for all the content that I'll be going over. You should also note that I'll be referencing some of the stuff we've discussed in previous videos, but as always I'll try to do so in a way where you can watch along and understand what's going on without having seen the previous videos, although it certainly helps. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at Bremen, first giving you an overview of the town, then going through the sort of scenes or locations I would want to prepare, and then going into more detail with how we could run these scenes and locations and the quest, the Lake Monster quest. Bremen is a small fishing town just north of Targos. The road between the two towns have snowed over, making Bremen even more secluded and isolated than usual. Bremen is a small town. It has only about 150 inhabitants. The speaker is this old, bordering on dementia dwarf, who has been a good speaker but is getting less useful as time passes. The town's militia consists of only 25 tribal warriors and 2 veterans, making it one of the smallest fighting forces in 10 towns. As described in the book, the inhabitants of Bremen sacrifice warmth to a rill, which means that they, for some days or nights, go without warmth to sort of appease the Frostmaiden. Like all the other towns that border Merdweldon, this large lake in the northwestern part of 10 towns, Bremen has a rivalry with the other towns around the lake. There's only 2 locations described in Bremen. We have Buried Treasures, an inn run by a human commoner named Cora, who can tell the adventurers about her son, who after getting lost out in the cold came back and were very different and had sort of this shard of ice. After some time, some people from elsewhere in 10 towns wearing the same sort of shards came looking for her son, and took him back to a place with a castle, so that could be either Caer Konig or Cardinal as far as she thinks. We also get a description of the 5 taverns center, but this description is very vague. Basically, there's 5 taverns run by 5 brothers, and that's about what we get out of that. The quest in Bremen is called Lake Monster and is in essence about going into the lake, discovering that an awakened Plesiosaurus is causing trouble, and solving that issue by speaking with it or defeating it in combat. This encounter starts when the characters are approached by either a dwarf or a half-elf researcher who wants to know more about the Plesiosaurus. So there's a couple of scenes that I would prepare if the characters go to Bremen. First off, there's a scene at the Buried Treasures, if the characters go there, where they may speak with Cora and sort of get this little foreshadowing or quest hook about finding her son with the Knights of the Black Sword in Cardinal. We may also want to prepare just one tavern. We can use the same tavern for each of the 5 Dwarven taverns. That doesn't really matter too much, just changing a minor detail here and there. But we may want to stay ready for the characters to visit one or more of these taverns. I of course also want to prepare how we would give the characters the Lake Monster quest, and I think there's a few ways to do this, also some that aren't in the book. I don't see the need to prepare much more than this, because Bremen isn't really a large town. It's not maybe supposed to have a lot going on, and I'm not expecting the characters to stay there for very long either. Alright, so going into a bit more detail with the locations. At the Buried Treasures, we'll have Cora, as described in the book, perhaps tell the story about her son. Whether or not you want her to do that is of course entirely up to you, and whether or not you want the Knights of the Black Sword to feature more heavily in your story. Because learning about her son will probably get the characters to investigate more closely as they come upon Cardinal when they get down south later in the adventure. What I would suggest is that unless you're ready for your characters to make that journey right now, is that you have Cora simply put it out like, and would you please keep an eye out for my son, or if you find yourselves near Caer Konig or Cardinal, perhaps you would sort of look into it and see if you can find him and just check if he's all right. As for the 5 dwarven taverns in center of town, I think that this is where you maybe want to direct the characters if they're looking for information or if you want them to have some rumors about other quests in other towns. If you have been following along with this video series, the characters in this scenario would probably be coming from Targos and maybe looking for the cold-hearted killer or looking for more information about Oral and her frost druids, and perhaps also be looking for information about Nas Lantomir, this wizard from the Arcane Brotherhood, if Velin, another wizard from the Brotherhood, has asked them to do so. So these are the pieces of information I would let the characters learn more about if they visit one of these 5 taverns. As for actually describing the tavern, you can go with a more generic tavern description. It's a small tap room. There's a handful of disgruntled fishers, perhaps in each, or maybe just 1 or 2, since there are 5 taverns dividing the entire business between them. And you can sort of replace one feature. The tavern each has a name, which probably could be illustrated on a sign with a symbol that fits that name and so on. So just giving them a bit of a different tone each tavern. As for the dwarves themselves, I think it's kind of fun playing up this rivalry between them, getting angry with the characters if they are heading to another tavern or if they've just been at one, or perhaps going out into the street and trying to pull the characters into their taverns respectively, maybe even getting into a scuffle with their brothers because the dwarves are so intent on competing of any business they get, and there's very little business in Bremen. I just realized that I've been calling these brothers dwarves all along, but in the book it says that they can actually be of any race. So yeah, in my head they're obviously dwarves, but you can make them any race you would like to. As for the various pieces of information the characters may be looking for, I think that'll make sense for the characters to learn that the cold-hearted killer and Torque's caravan hasn't been to town. So that'll tell them that it's either in Tourmaline or somewhere else if they've already been to Targos and knows it is not there anymore. While the locals haven't seen Torque's caravan recently, you can have some locals explain if the characters ask about a blue-eyed man or something weird like that. Explain how a frozen, ice-cold man came almost naked through town a few months ago, and this could be Sefik Kaltro after having shipwrecked out by the sea of moving ice and being possessed by this frost druid spirit. He came into Bremen seeming quite off to the locals, and certainly something they would remember even months later because so few visitors come to town, and a naked, piercingly blue-eyed man coming through town would sort of increase the mystery of this cold-hearted killer and maybe clue the characters into there being something supernatural about Sefik Kaltro even before they meet him and engage him in combat. As for the frost druids, if we are building upon what we've done previously in Targos, where a druid had passed through town and convinced the locals to make sacrifices, human sacrifices to a will, we can expand upon that in Bremen by having the locals here explain how a frost druid some months ago passed through town. She tried to convince them to make human sacrifices but failed, and instead they settled on making sacrifices of warmth to our will, going without warmth each night or one night a month or so on. You can also expand even further upon this by having the locals explain how this is also around the same time that the speaker, Dorbulgruf Shalskar, these Forgotten Realms names are just... it's around the time that he became also more dementia-ridden and began getting lost and forgetting where he was. So if the players sort of like tie these two things together, they may seek out the speaker. They can perhaps find him in the town hall, which is just the only 2-story house in town, a sort of rundown place where the elderly dwarf is together with perhaps a daughter or a son who's taking care of them, letting them in. They can see, all right, the speaker isn't in very good shape. He's sitting around vacant-eyed. But if the characters have access to spells such as Lesser Restoration or Remove Curse, you could allow them to actually restore and revitalize him by removing a curse or magical affliction that a frost druid has put upon him. This is, of course, a scenario you can expand upon and work upon a little, but it's one idea for how we can once again emphasize how the frost druids are going around 10 towns causing trouble. Lastly, there's the rumors about Nas Lantomir, if you're using that little hook. And I think that Bremen is a good place for the characters to learn more about this if they ask around. Perhaps a fisherman has heard about a ship from Loskan that was supposed to come in from the north, and Bremen being the most northwestern town in 10 towns, is usually the town that people arriving from sea would get to first, but they haven't had anyone come in from the ship, and perhaps a fisherman has been up there by the sea of moving ice and have seen a shipwreck. This could be the Dark Duchess, where you may also want to move Naslantomir's corpse, but that is way off in the future in this video series. Just know that that is something you may want to do. Alright, so in Bremen we get this Lake Monster quest. I think it's a pretty good quest. It's one of the quests that will give us some foreshadowing. It sort of indicates that the Frost Druids are going around 10 towns causing trouble, which is good. You can also point the characters to Lonelywood if you have the Plesiosaurus, give the characters a bit more information. And it's also runnable for any level, since you can have the Plesiosaurus be more or less aggressive depending on what level the characters are. If they're first level, you probably don't want to go full on with the Plesiosaurus, since that could be pretty lethal, especially out in the water. But if they're higher level, they can probably contend with a Plesiosaurus pretty easily, even if they are in the creature's natural environment. So the book would have the adventure start as a dwarf approaches the characters and wants the characters to go fish on the lake. He thinks he's hired them already to do so, and he'll offer a meager payment for them going out and fishing. The discussion with the dwarf is interrupted as a half-elf researcher comes by and instead wants the character to go out and find out what's been going on with this lake monster, or the monster of Mer Dweldon as they call it. There's not a reward given for this or promised at first, which is kind of weird because the researcher does have a reward. So if you want to maybe incentivize the characters a bit more to take this quest, you can have them offer the reward as they are given the quest. That sort of makes it more likely that they will actually go along. As the characters go out into the lake to investigate this lake monster, you can run things mostly by the book, although you may want to sort of reduce the table that is here, just picking the things that you think are most entertaining and maybe keeping it to 1 or 2 events before the Plesiosaurus shows up, just to make sure that things aren't dragged out too long. As for actually running the counter, we are once again given a table of possible things the Plesiosaurus could do. I think that most likely the most fun thing is that the Plesiosaurus splashes some waters on the characters and then tries to capsize the boat before sort of giving them the opportunity to speak with it so they can get some information from it. As for the information it gives, I think it's very nice here if you haven't already had the characters go to Lonelywood, if the Plesiosaurus would give them a bit more detail about what's happened to it, describing this Frost Druid, which could be Ravison, as the book suggests, or Vernis, her sister, sort of telling the characters that there are 2 Frost Druids, and then pointing them to the other edge of Lake Mer Dweldon, saying that this druid that awakened the Plesiosaurus has last been seen over by Lonelywood, so the characters will know that maybe heading up to Lonelywood would get them more information about Oral and the Frost Druids and the everlasting Rime and whatnot. Alright, so that sort of wraps up how I will run Bremen. As you can probably tell, there's not a whole lot to it. There's not a lot I would add in or a lot of scenes that I will run here, because I'm expecting the characters to not stay in Bremen for too long. I think it's fine for the town to function as sort of a little information hub. They can learn about the Frost Druid, they can learn that the Sephikaltro and Torx Caravan hasn't been here if they're looking for that, and they can sort of complete this little fun quest, get a meager reward, and then head on their way back, probably going back down through Targus and to Tourmaline if they haven't already been there. And if you're following sort of along with the flow that I've been establishing over the last couple of videos, or if they've already been to Tourmaline and Lonelywood, they can instead head back to Targus, where they maybe received a mountain climb quest and are sent across to Caer Konig and the Durga plotline. Alright, so that wraps up this video on how you can run Bremen. It's a short one, but hopefully you got something out of it. And as always, if you like what you do here, comment, like, subscribe, everything helps out. And check out the Patreon at patreon.com/eventyr. And you can also buy the resources, whether that's the DM's resources, the Frostmaiden map pack, which has just the maps, or perhaps just read the articles, which are available for free on eventyrgames.com. So in the next video, I'll be tackling some of the other towns and keep moving on through 10 towns. All right, that's it for this one. Have a good one.